When relational databases were first introduced in the 70s, it provided a breakthrough for businesses to better manage data and record transactions. Now, a radically different approach, known as event sourcing, is gaining in popularity. So today we're going to understand a little bit more about how it works and discuss how it can provide a better clarity of what happened in the past. So Johannes, what exactly is event sourcing?
Event sourcing, technically, is the idea that the state in your computer system is only the reflection of a series of events. So that's all that you can see in a computer system, all the data that is recorded. You only have events, and if you have anything that is like a total on display or any information on the system, is only the direct result of, I would say, the series of events. And if we want to make that, very, very concrete, the idea would be, for example, if you have a stock level that is on display in your inventory management software, there is no such thing as a stock level in the software. All you have is just a stream of stock movements, so quantities were put there, picked from there, etc. And when you, I would say, consolidate all those events, you end up with a synthetic number that is the current stock level. But the idea with event sourcing is that the system does not have anything but event as far as the past is concerned.
Okay, so whereabouts are these kind of event sourcing techniques used? Is it something that we're seeing often in the marketplace?
In the 70s, some choices were made about what would be the way to represent, I would say, a company's data in general and the past in general. I mean, it might sound very philosophical, but it's actually a very broad question. Is you want to digitalize your company, you need to have an electronic representation of your company and its past, because I mean, data in general is all about the past, even if it's a very recent past, it's a past. So basically, you want to have like a reflection of the past, and it turned out that there are, I would say, many, many ways to do that. A few of those ways becomes incredibly popular in the late 70s and maintained their popularity for the last couple of decades that followed. But it's not the only way to look at it. And you see, it's very intriguing is that when you have a certain way of doing things that becomes exceedingly popular, it's not just in software and not just in supply chain, it might become so ubiquitous that at some point you don't even realize that it's actually possible to do it in very, very different ways. So what happened was this, I would say, relational model one. And with that, there was the type of application that were built on top of that. And basically, I would say, the vast, vast majority of supply chain software nowadays fall into the category of what is known as CRUD software. So CRUD is actually an acronym. That's a wordplay. It's for create, read, update, delete. So the idea is that you have tables. Each table has fields. And then what your software does is that you can basically add a line, that's create. You can read an existing line. You can modify, that's the update, an existing line, and you can delete an existing line. So, and this is it. And the idea is that this model is actually very, very simple when you think about it. So those four verbs, CRUD, create, read, update, delete, manage to basically take over the world of supply chain so that you can reflect pretty much everything with that. And it has been very successful, very popular, but it's really not the same approach. And the interesting thing is that there are other alternative approaches, and event sourcing is one of them.
Okay, let's look at that sort of the popularity of that CRUD approach then. Did that introduce any kind of constraints and any kind of assumptions that we're kind of now used to maybe working with?
Yes, it did introduce something that is very puzzling when you think about it. It's from I would say, almost a philosophical perspective, is that the past is mutable. So, I mean, when you think about your day-to-day experience, if something happened in the past, you can't change it, right? That's just and yet in computer systems, I mean, I would say modern enterprise systems, ERPs, MRPs, etc., etc. So all those classes of I would say, of complex software systems that run companies and run their supply chains. The vast majority of those softwares who are built on, I would say, the CRUD design principle, the past is completely immutable. If you start to think about that, you think that suddenly you end up with all sorts of bizarre situations that are only the result of the fact that the past is mutable, and then that can lead to all sorts, I would say, of bugs, of way of thinking things through the systems that are just plain odd, a lot of complexity, and overall, I would say it just actually just collide with what you would intuitively think about the system.
So are there any other benefits to event sourcing other than just having an understanding about perhaps what's happened in the past?
Yes, there is one that is actually very significant and just incredibly mundane, is bug fixing. You know, those large supply chain software systems, they have bugs, you know, undesirable features all over the place. And typically it goes on, you know, for literally decades. And yeah, there are like thousands of tickets that are open and pushed to IT, and most of them never get fixed. And it's so frustrating. And actually, and you would say, well, how does event sourcing even relate to bug fixing? Well, it does relate quite a lot. I mean, at Lokad, we have been using, you know, event sourcing internally for a decade. And it's very, very interesting because when you face a bug, when you have like an event source, so basically all the information that is in the system is represented as a series of events. So when you want to, you know, debug something, you only need to replay the events one by one. And due to the fact that the only data that exists in your system are this stream of events, you can, whenever there is like a crash or something, you know, unexpected that happened, you can replay the events and then reproduce the exact same situation, and then it becomes very easy to, you know, to fix the problem, because whatever problems happen in the past, you can, due to by design that all the data that exists in your system is just a series of events, you can reproduce the exact situation that created the problem and fix it. And let's compare to, you know, the alternative situation where all your state of your system is mutable. The problem is that by the time, you know, you face a problem, there is a glitch, then stock levels are all wrong, etc. The problem is that stock levels keep changing, you know, and by the time the IT team is going to look at the problem will be gone. So and they can't reproduce, and that they can't fix it. And it's something that is exceedingly, I would say, frustrating as a software engineer when you're dealing with a system that is highly mutable, is that most of the bugs turn out to be, you know, quantum bugs. So it's something that is, or Heisenbergs. So there is a bug, but when you look at it, it just vanishes. So there is no bug. And then you stop looking at it, and bam, it's back again. And it's so frustrating. So, and then that ends up with, it's a very mundane process where you create a ticket, say, there is this bug, and then IT comes back to you, say, well, I don't see it. And then you say, well, I am still seeing it. And so IT say, well, I've done something, I think it's fixed. And then 3 months down the road, it's back again. And so event sourcing is very interesting in this respect because, again, it gives you a completely deterministic way to regenerate those problems and thus fix them for good. And again, if you look at supply chain problems at large, I would say even if software is not going to solve all the problems, it turned out that actually software is frequently creating a fair share of the problems that modern supply chains are facing.
Okay, so let's sort of move back and look a bit more in detail at sort of event sourcing. This idea about looking at every single mundane operation that's happened in a supply chain sounds a little bit dull. How easy then would it be to go back and check what's happened and sort of get to the root cause of a problem?
So the thing is, another way to look at it is that why isn't it the default, you know, to just record the events as they come and say, this is the past, you know? And when you look at what I would say people have done, for example, accountants have done for centuries, they have ledgers, And ledgers have this property of normally being like immutable. You only append stuff to a ledger. And if you get a transaction wrong, you don't delete a transaction in the past. You just add another transaction that says this transaction, this previous transaction was incorrect. Here is a corrective, and that's how you work. So you don't rewrite the past. You just append more stuff at the end. But at the end of the 70s, computer storage, data storage, was incredibly expensive. And thus, the idea of having this mutability of the past was kind of a nice feature if you're really, really tight. So the idea is that if you're ledger, you're an accountant, and we tell you, you have only 10 pages. And if you run out of space, the only thing that you have is an eraser. So what you would do, well, you will kind of try to summarize the totals, for your books, and you will maybe add a few transactions, and whenever you run out of space, you will just erase the past transaction, update the totals, and this is it. So you will have to, if I tell you you have a large company and you have only, 10 pages, 10 blank pages of space and a pen and an eraser to manage, you would have to resort very, very frequently to the eraser. And that's literally what happened, late 70s, early 80s, is that basically the entire world of software went to a certain path that was actually making sense due to the fact that data storage was so incredibly expensive at the time. Fast forward, 4 decades later, I would say data storage is just insanely cheap. And so, literally, I checked actually the latest price. You can buy, it's fantastic. You can buy a 1 terabyte hard drive for $50. That's just insanely, insanely cheap. So obviously, if you want to have like a super reliable data storage, you will need to have like multiple copies, plus a system to manage the copies, etc. But basically, we are way below $1 per gigabyte, and thus it's data storage is just very, very cheap.
And sort of event sourcing is very much kind of the raw kind of architecture of an entire kind of ERP system. So these are only kind of subjects that are really of interest to maybe those large multinationals and big companies like SAP. So should smaller companies really be interested in something like this?
But that's interesting. Event sourcing, I think it's a philosophical perspective on the past, which is basically the past is immutable, and thus the computer systems that you need that you have needs to reflect that, or you're going to end up with tons of shenanigans. But the thing is that the vast majority of ERPs are not using that. So that's the first thing. The first catch is, I would say, the vast majority, and HSIP, for example, is mostly not using event sourcing. So that's very intriguing. When you look at who is using event sourcing nowadays, I would say it's tech leaders who are typically not producing supply chain software. Maybe except for Amazon, Zalando, and Alibaba, the companies who operate their own supply chain with their own bespoke software. But and in terms of benefits, I would say the interesting thing is that nowadays a lot of companies try to have like more transparency on the supply chain. They want to have more to be more efficient, less waste, to be leaner, more reactive, etc. And they are struggling a lot with their IT systems. And although it's the sort of problems that are very diffuse, so there is no single answer to the problem. But what I see is that event sourcing is very interesting because it points out a specific flow of a specific defect of, I would say, the overly dominant way to design software that is used for supply chain problems, and usually, I would say most practitioners, and I would say, are not even aware of this perspective, that there are other perspectives. So I think event sourcing is very interesting, not necessarily because it's the ultimate answer to those problems, but just because the very fact that it exists proves that actually this CRUD methodology, when I say CRUD, it's again, that's the acronym of create, read, update, delete. It just shows that this CRUD methodology, which is a way to build software systems to operate supply chains, is just not the end game. It's just one of the way. And this design pattern was actually strongly influenced by economic constraints that were only relevant, I would say, that were only relevant during the 70s, the 80s, and already by the end of the 90s, that was kind of fading away.
Okay, so now if we kind of look ahead to the future then, now the data storage is incredibly cheap, we've kind of overcome those kind of barriers. Can you see kind of event sourcing being more commonplace across the market in the next couple of decades? And are there any barriers that we still need to overcome for that to happen?
I mean, first, event sourcing is becoming more prevalent just because Amazon is growing bigger. So just every single time that Amazon takes 1% market share, well, event sourcing has kind of become like 1% more prevalent in the market. So I mean, it's, and when I say Amazon, I would say, all the other, I would say, tech-driven company that are just eating the market. So yes, it's definitely becoming more prevalent. Again, the market is, that's my theory, is a great filter. It's not an educator. So things don't become more popular because they get adopted. They become more popular just because the companies that were not using that just go bust and disappear. And thus, the companies that are left just happen to be using the stuff that works more. So again, I would say then, can it become more popular? I would say certainly. And when I look, I mean, across the customer base of Lokad, we have about, I would say, something like a quarter or 1/5 of our clients who have, I would say, bespoke in-house, software systems to run the company. So if you have in-house software systems, then I would say I would strongly advise that you have a look at event sourcing, even if you don't adopt event sourcing straight away, because it's a complete paradigm change for your for the design of your software. There is still a lot to be learned, and actually, if you are very familiar with event sourcing, that lets you actually do CRUD, the usual way of doing supply chain software nowadays, in ways where you mitigate this, those problems of mutability of the past. Actually, if you're very careful about the way you can actually mutate the past in your CRUD design, then you can have something that is much closer to event sourcing. So you don't necessarily have to rewrite everything to kind of get closer to that. And I would say also, it's not just a problem for IT. That's the thing with event sourcing, is that people would probably dismiss that, oh, that's a super geeky thing that is only of interest for a database architect. But my answer is no. I believe that's a sort of very high-level concepts that are, I would say, the cornerstone, that should be the cornerstone of a supply chain practice. Just like the fact that a ledger cannot be rewritten is actually a cornerstone of accounting principle. And if you're an accountant, you know that you're not supposed to go back in the books of the previous years and rewrite the transaction extra. And people would not say, oh, this thing about ledger is just a software detail. Well, it turned out absolutely not. I mean, those principles were established way before the advent of computers. And so I believe that if we take into account the fact that being a supply chain practitioner involves dealing with a lot of data, because it's very hard to perceive the reality of your supply chain. Supply chain is vast, it's complex, it's multi-site. So basically, by design, if you are a supply chain practitioner, you cannot say, I will just see it with my own eyes. You can see a store, you can see one warehouse, but you can't be everywhere. So you are, I would say, data-driven, I would say, by necessity. The only things that you see about your supply chain are basically the numbers that are pulled through many, many systems. And thus, I believe that just like an accountant, you need to have certain, I would say, guiding principle on the way this data is collected, organized, and processed. And if we go back to event sourcing, I think, is something that we're encouraged, I would say, supply chain practitioners to really have a good look at it, just because it will help you identify tons of, I would say, of mundane problems in your organization.
Okay, brilliant. Well, if we keep on waiting for Amazon to take another percent, we'll be soon at 100%, and Amazon will have taken over the world.
No, that's okay. I mean, that's these economies of scale. You know, at some point, that's something that will save the rest of the market. That at some point, companies become so large that they collapse under their own weight. It's just exceedingly difficult to become, you know, absolutely gigantic. Yet, the thing is that it will prevent Amazon from taking 100% of the marketplace. But the problem is that it will just be, you know, other companies that are kind of like Amazon that will take the rest of the market.
Okay, watch this space, huh? So that's everything for this week. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time. Bye for now.